In Burma's mountains, as the sun was going down, Colonel James Parker looked at his soldiers. It was a hot evening in August 1944. It had been raining for 3 days straight, but finally, the rain had stopped. Everything was still wet, the trees, the ground, and even the air felt damp. 500 men and women stood in straight lines in front of him. They were the soldiers of the 55th Infantry Battalion, and they were about to face something they would never forget. Colonel Parker was tired. You could see it in his face. He had deep wrinkles around his eyes and gray hair at his temples. At 45 years old, he was like a father figure to many of the young soldiers. But for one soldier, Tommy Parker, he really was a father. Tommy was his 20-year-old son who had joined the Army last year. Having his son here made Parker's job much harder. Every time he had to make a decision, he worried about Tommy's safety. The soldiers were standing in an open area surrounded by tall trees. Their boots were covered in mud, but they stood tall and proud. Parker cleared his throat and spoke loudly so everyone could hear him. "Tomorrow morning when the sun comes up, we will go into the Valley of Shadows." The soldiers started whispering to each other when they heard this. Everyone knew about this valley. The people who lived in nearby villages had told them stories about it. They said that over hundreds of years, any army that went into the valley never came back. Parker had told himself these were just stories to scare people, but deep down, something about this place made him worried. Mike Rodriguez, one of the youngest soldiers, was only 19. He was standing in line, feeling scared. Next to him was David Chen, who was 32 years old. Chen had been in the Army for 10 years and had become like a big brother to Rodriguez. When Chen saw that Rodriguez was scared, he whispered, "Don't worry, people just make up stories to scare us." But Rosalie Williams, who worked with the radio equipment, knew something wasn't right. She was 25 years old and very good at her job. For the past week, she had been hearing strange things on her radio. Sometimes she heard people talking in languages she didn't know. Other times she heard what sounded like old battles being fought, gunfire and explosions from far away. She hadn't told anyone about these sounds because she thought they wouldn't believe her. Now, as she stood there holding her gun, she wished she had told someone. That night, the Army camp was very quiet. Some soldiers were writing letters to their families back home. Others were making sure their guns were clean and ready. Small groups sat together, talking quietly about tomorrow's mission. In his tent, Colonel Parker was reading his orders one more time. The Japanese Army was supposed to be gathering in the valley, planning to attack. The 55th Battalion's job was simple: go into the valley, find out what the Japanese were doing, and if they could, stop their plans. But Parker knew from experience that nothing in war was ever as simple as it seemed. As it got darker, a thick white fog came from the valley and covered their camp. The fog seemed to give off a faint glow in the moonlight. What was really strange was how quiet everything became. Usually at night you could hear lots of sounds: insects buzzing, birds calling, animals moving in the trees. But now there was nothing. It was as if everything had gone silent. Rodriguez noticed something else weird. His compass, which soldiers used to find direction, wasn't working right. The needle kept spinning around and pointing in different directions. He showed it to Chen, who looked worried but didn't say anything. Tommy Parker was sitting by himself at the edge of the camp, looking toward the valley. He took out a picture from his pocket. It showed his mother and his 15-year-old sister back at their home in Kansas. Something felt very strange about this mission. He had never seen his father looking so worried before. Then he heard something that sounded like drums coming from the valley. When he asked other soldiers if they could hear it too, they all said no. In his tent, Colonel Parker wrote in his diary one last time. He wrote, "August 15th, 1944. Tomorrow we go into the Valley of Shadows. I pray God will keep us safe." Nobody knew it then, but these would be the last words anyone would read from him for a very long time. The fog got thicker and thicker as the night went on. It wrapped around the tents and trees like a white blanket. The next day, the 55th Battalion would walk into a place that would change their lives forever. None of them knew that this would be their last night together as normal soldiers. The Valley of Shadows was about to show them things that would blur the line between what was real and what wasn't, between those who were alive and those who weren't, between a normal war and something much older and stranger. The next morning started with a strange red sunrise. The fog was still there, making it hard to see more than 20 feet ahead. The soldiers ate their breakfast quietly. Nobody felt like talking much. Everyone could feel that something was different about today. Rosalie Williams was checking her radio equipment one last time. The strange sounds she had heard yesterday were gone. Now there was only static on all channels, which had never happened before. She walked over to Colonel Parker's tent to tell him about it, but stopped herself at the entrance. Through the tent's opening, she could see him kneeling down, praying, something she had never seen him do before. Mike Rodriguez was putting on his backpack when he noticed something odd. All the photos he had of his family back in Texas seemed blurry now, like someone had smeared the pictures. He showed them to David Chen, who pulled out his own photos. The same thing had happened to his. "Must be the dampness from all the rain," Chen said, but his voice shook a little as he said it. At exactly 6 in the morning, Colonel Parker gave the order to move out. The 500 soldiers formed a long line as they began walking toward the valley. The fog was so thick that they had to stay close to see each other. Their boots made squishing sounds in the wet ground. The trees around them were huge and old, their branches twisting together high above, blocking out most of the red sunlight. Tommy Parker was walking near the front of the line, close to his father. He kept hearing those drum sounds from last night, getting louder as they got closer to the valley. This time, other soldiers heard them too. "Japanese drums," someone whispered, but Colonel Parker shook his head. "The Japanese don't use drums like that," he said quietly. After walking for 2 hours, they came to the entrance of the Valley of Shadows. It was like a giant doorway made of rock, with steep cliffs on both sides. The fog seemed to pour out of this entrance like water. As they stood there, Rosalie's radio suddenly came to life. Through the static, they could hear voices, some speaking English, some Japanese, and some in languages nobody knew. But what was strangest was that some of the English voices seemed to be using words and phrases from World War I, almost 30 years ago. Rodriguez's compass was now spinning so fast it looked like a blur. Other soldiers checked their compasses too. All of them were doing the same thing. The fog had gotten so thick that it was like walking through clouds. Soldiers had to hold on to each other's backpacks to avoid getting lost. Colonel Parker ordered everyone to stop. He pulled out his map, but the ink on it was running, like the paper was wet, even though it wasn't. The valley ahead of them split into 3 paths. The map showed only one path, but now there were clearly 3. He looked at his officers, unsure for the first time since the war began. That's when they all heard it. The sound of marching feet coming from all 3 paths. Lots of marching feet, but they couldn't see anyone. The sound seemed to be coming toward them. Rosalie's radio crackled again, and this time everyone could hear it clearly. Voices of soldiers giving orders. But the voices were from different times, different wars, all mixed together. Chen raised his rifle, pointing it into the fog. "Sir," he called out to Colonel Parker, "there's something moving out there." Other soldiers raised their rifles too. Through the fog, they could see shadows moving. The shadows looked like soldiers, hundreds of them, but they weren't solid. You could see right through them. Colonel Parker stood very still, watching the shadows come closer. His son Tommy moved next to him, both of them holding their rifles ready. The drum sounds were very loud now, seeming to come from everywhere at once. The air had gotten very cold, even though it was a summer morning. Then they heard a voice coming from the fog. It sounded like an American soldier, but old, like from an old radio show. "Welcome to the valley, boys. We've been waiting for you." The voice laughed, and other laughs joined in. American, Japanese, and others, all mixing together in the fog. The 55th Battalion stood there, their guns pointed at enemies they couldn't really see, about to step into a mystery that would become one of the strangest stories of World War II. None of them knew that in just a few hours they would all disappear, leaving behind only their footprints in the mud, and questions that would take decades to answer. Colonel Parker knew he had to make a decision quickly. The shadow soldiers were getting closer, and his men were getting more scared. He raised his hand to signal everyone to stay calm. "Nobody shoots unless I give the order," he said in a loud, clear voice that helped steady his nervous troops. Rosalie Williams was turning her radio dial frantically, trying to contact their base camp. "Colonel," she called out, her voice shaking, "all our radio signals are dead. I can only hear the strange voices now." The voices from her radio were getting louder. They could hear bits of conversations from what sounded like the Civil War, World War I, and even wars they didn't recognize. The shadow soldiers were now only 50 feet away. In the thick fog, the 55th Battalion could see them better now. Some wore old American uniforms from past wars. Others wore Japanese uniforms, German uniforms, and some wore armor that looked hundreds of years old. But the strangest thing was that you could see right through all of them, like they were made of smoke. Mike Rodriguez was shaking so hard he could barely hold his rifle. David Chen put a hand on his shoulder to steady him. "Remember your training," Chen whispered, but his own face was white with fear. The temperature had dropped so low they could see their breath in the air, even though it was summer. Tommy Parker stayed close to his father. He could now clearly see the faces of the shadow soldiers. Some looked young, some old, but all had the same tired, sad look in their eyes. One of them, wearing a uniform from World War I, stepped forward and spoke again. "You have two choices, Colonel Parker. You can turn around and leave this valley right now, or you can join us. But if you go forward, none of you will ever return home. At least not in the way you came." Colonel Parker stepped forward to face the ghost soldier. "We have our orders," he said firmly. "There are Japanese forces gathering in this valley, planning an attack. We have to stop them." The ghost soldier smiled sadly. "The Japanese? Yes, they're here too. They came last month, all 2,000 of them. They're part of us now, just like the others." Suddenly, more shadow soldiers appeared from the other two paths. They were surrounded now. Rosalie's radio was playing sounds of battles from different times, all mixed together. Musket fire from centuries ago, modern gunfire, sword fights, and the screams of wounded men from every era. Rodriguez looked down at his hands and gasped. In the strange light, he could partly see through them. "Sergeant Chen!" he called out in panic. Chen looked at his own hands. The same thing was happening to him. All through the battalion, soldiers were starting to fade, becoming transparent like the shadow soldiers. Colonel Parker tried to maintain order. "Stay in formation," he shouted, but his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from far away. Tommy watched in horror as his father's figure began to fade too. He tried to grab his father's arm, but his hand passed right through it. Rosalie Williams' radio suddenly went silent. In the quiet, they could hear a new sound. Thousands of voices singing an old army song, but in many languages all at once. The song seemed to come from the ground, the air, and their own heads all at the same time. The shadow soldiers moved closer, but now it was harder to tell them apart from the men and women of the 55th Battalion. They were all becoming the same, shadows of soldiers in the fog. Colonel Parker looked at his son one last time and managed to say, "I'm sorry, Tommy." Then the fog grew even thicker, swirling around them like a white river. Back at their base camp, 3 hours had passed since the 55th Battalion had entered the valley. The rescue team that was sent to check on them found only empty paths. There were footprints leading into the valley, but they stopped suddenly, as if the entire battalion had vanished into thin air. All they found was Rosalie's radio, still warm, sitting on a rock. When they picked it up, they heard a faint whisper coming through the static. "We are all soldiers here, from every time, from every war. We guard the valley now. We will always guard the valley." The 55th Battalion had joined the Phantom Army of the valley, but this was not the end of their story. It was just the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the military for years to come. Because sometimes on quiet nights, people walking near the valley would hear marching feet, see strange lights, and pick up radio signals of soldiers talking. Soldiers who had disappeared decades ago, but somehow still seemed to be fighting their own strange war in the Valley of Shadows. For the soldiers of the 55th Battalion, everything changed after the fog took them. It felt like falling asleep and being awake at the same time. When they could see clearly again, the valley looked different. The trees were the same, but now they could see through them to other times. Other battles, like looking through layers of glass. Mike Rodriguez found himself standing next to soldiers from different times. On his left was a young Confederate soldier from the Civil War who said his name was Billy. On his right was a Japanese soldier named Tanaka, who had disappeared in the valley just a month ago. Strangely, Rodriguez could understand them all, even though they spoke different languages. It was as if the valley itself was translating for them. Rosalie Williams discovered that her radio now picked up signals from every war that had ever been fought. She could hear soldiers from ancient Rome talking about their battles, Japanese warriors from hundreds of years ago discussing their plans, and American soldiers from future wars that hadn't even happened yet. "Time doesn't work normally here," explained a World War I soldier named Jenkins. "In the valley, all wars happen at the same time." David Chen tried to touch a tree, but his hand passed right through it. Then an old soldier wearing armor from ancient China showed him how to make himself solid again. "Just think about being solid," the old soldier said. "The valley responds to your thoughts." Chen practiced until he could pick up leaves from the ground, but when he tried to put them in his pocket, they fell through his now transparent hand. Colonel Parker and his son Tommy stayed close together, trying to understand their new existence. They found out that they weren't dead, but they weren't exactly alive either. "We exist in between," explained a Roman soldier who had been in the valley for over 2,000 years. "We are the guardians of this place now. We make sure no army ever uses this valley to start new wars." The soldiers learned that the Valley of Shadows was actually a very old and powerful place. It had been taking soldiers from every war throughout history, but not randomly. It only took those who had good hearts, who fought because they had to, not because they wanted to. These soldiers became part of the valley's guardian army, protecting it from those who would use its power for evil. Rodriguez discovered he could now walk through solid rock just by thinking about it. Chen found out he could appear anywhere in the valley just by wishing to be there. Rosalie learned that through her radio, she could talk to soldiers from any time in history. It was scary but also amazing. Tommy Parker had the strangest experience of all. He could see glimpses of his home back in Kansas, his mother and sister going about their daily lives. But when he tried to call out to them, they couldn't hear him. "The valley lets us watch over our loved ones," said a soldier from World War I. "But we can never speak to them. That's the price we pay for becoming guardians." They also discovered why the valley had chosen them. A group of Japanese scientists had been planning to use the valley's power to create a terrible new weapon. The 55th Battalion had been brought into the valley to help stop them, but not in the way they expected. As phantom soldiers, they could do things no living army could do. Colonel Parker gathered everyone together. Standing in a clearing surrounded by soldiers from every time in history, he looked at his battalion. They were all partly transparent now, glowing softly in the strange light of the valley. "We still have a mission," he told them. "It's different from what we expected, but it might be the most important mission any soldiers have ever had." Rosalie's radio crackled with a new message. Through the static, they heard about another army approaching the valley, one with dark intentions. The Phantom Battalion would soon face their first test as guardians. But now they had the power of every army that had ever disappeared into the valley, fighting alongside them. As the sun set in the Valley of Shadows, though it wasn't quite the same sun as the one that shone in the regular world, the soldiers of the 55th Battalion prepared for a battle unlike any they had trained for. They were no longer just American soldiers in World War II. They had become part of something much bigger, an eternal army protecting one of the world's most powerful and dangerous places. The new enemy was coming from the north, a special Japanese unit that had learned about the valley's powers. Rosalie's radio picked up their communications. "They have machines," she told Colonel Parker. "They're trying to capture the valley's energy." Through her radio, They could hear the Japanese soldiers talking about special devices that could trap spirits. Mike Rodriguez was scared, but in a different way now. As a phantom soldier, bullets couldn't hurt him anymore. His new friend Billy, the Civil War soldier, taught him how to become completely invisible. "Just think about fading away," Billy said. Rodriguez practiced until he could disappear and reappear at will. David Chen discovered another useful power. He could touch living people's minds and see their thoughts. The old Chinese warrior who had helped him before explained that this power had to be used carefully. "We can show them memories," the warrior said. "Make them feel what war is really like. Sometimes that's enough to change their minds about fighting." Colonel Parker gathered all the Phantom soldiers, not just his battalion, but thousands from throughout history. They floated above the valley floor, an army of glowing figures from every time period. Parker felt strange giving orders to Roman centurions and medieval knights, but they listened to his plan with respect. "We'll divide into 4 groups," Parker said. "Rosalie, you'll lead the first group. Use your radio powers to confuse their communications. Chen, take the second group and work on their minds. Show them why they should turn back. Rodriguez, you and the Civil War soldiers will become invisible and get close to their machines. Tommy, you're with me in the third group. We'll be the ones they see, the ones to warn them." As the living Japanese soldiers entered the valley, everything was quiet at first. Their machines beeped and whirred, measuring strange energies in the air. They carried special backpacks with glowing tubes that were supposed to catch spirits. Suddenly, Rosalie and her group of phantom soldiers started their attack. She had learned how to make her radio messages come through on their equipment. The Japanese soldiers heard voices in their headphones, thousands of them, speaking in every language, telling them to leave the valley. Some of the soldiers pulled their headphones off in fear. Rodriguez and his invisible team floated right through the Japanese machines. They discovered they could touch mechanical things if they concentrated hard enough. Pieces of equipment started falling apart mysteriously. Wires disconnected themselves. Batteries drained for no reason. The Japanese technicians couldn't understand what was happening. Chen and his group began their work. When they touched the minds of the living soldiers, they shared memories of every war ever fought, all the pain, fear, and sadness. Many of the Japanese soldiers sat down, overwhelmed by the feelings. Some began to cry, understanding for the first time what they were really doing. Then Colonel Parker made his move. He and Tommy appeared in front of the Japanese unit, along with hundreds of other phantom soldiers. They weren't trying to look scary. Instead, they looked sad and tired, like soldiers who had seen too much war. Parker spoke, and somehow the Japanese soldiers could understand him. "This valley doesn't belong to any army or any country," he said. "It belongs to all soldiers who ever lived and died. We guard it now. If you continue with your plans, you'll have to fight every soldier from every war in history. Is that what you want?" The Japanese commander stared at the Phantom Army. Through Chen's power, he felt the weight of all those years of war. He looked at his machines, now broken and useless. He looked at his men, many of them shaking with emotion from the memories Chen had shared. Then he gave the order to retreat. As the Japanese unit left the valley, Rosalie picked up a new sound on her radio, cheering in many languages. The Phantom soldiers had won their first battle without firing a single shot. They had protected the valley's power from being used for more war. That night, the 55th Battalion sat with soldiers from other times, sharing stories. Rodriguez taught the Civil War soldiers to play cards. Chen learned ancient Chinese battle songs. Rosalie listened to radio messages from battles not yet fought. Tommy watched his family back home through a window in the air. They were having dinner, leaving an empty chair for him as always. Colonel Parker looked at his new army with pride. They had found a different way to fight, not with weapons, but with memories and understanding. The Valley of Shadows had chosen them for this special duty, and they had proved themselves worthy of the trust. But all of them knew this was just the beginning. As long as there were wars in the world, there would be people trying to use the Valley's power. The Phantom Battalion would have to stay vigilant, protecting their mysterious new home for years to come. 3 months after the 55th Battalion disappeared, a young Army detective named Jack Morris arrived at the base camp near the Valley of Shadows. He was 35 years old, with bright blue eyes and a notebook he carried everywhere. The Army had sent him to find out what happened to the missing soldiers. Morris didn't believe in ghost stories or magic. He thought there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe the battalion had gotten lost, or maybe Japanese soldiers had captured them. But as he interviewed people at the base camp, he started to feel confused. "The footprints just stopped," said Tom Wilson, one of the rescue team members who had first discovered the battalion was missing. 500 people don't just vanish into thin air, but that's exactly what it looked like. Wilson showed Morris the photographs they had taken that day, clear footprints in the mud that suddenly ended, as if the soldiers had been lifted into the sky. In his small office at the base camp, Morris spread out all the evidence on his desk. He had Rosalie Williams's radio, still working but only playing strange, impossible signals. He had Colonel Parker's last journal entry. He even had some of the blurry photographs from the soldiers' pockets, found scattered on the ground where they had disappeared. What really bothered Morris were the new reports coming in. Villagers near the valley said they kept seeing American soldiers walking through walls. Patrol units reported hearing music from different time periods floating through the air. One Japanese prisoner they captured swore he had seen an entire army of ghost soldiers who had forced his unit to retreat. Late one night, as Morris sat in his office reading reports, his radio suddenly turned on by itself. Through the static, he heard a woman's voice. It was Rosalie Williams. "Detective Morris," she said clearly, "if you want to know the truth about us, come to the valley tomorrow at sunrise. Come alone." Morris wasn't sure if he was going crazy or really hearing a missing soldier's voice. But the next morning, he found himself walking toward the valley entrance just as the sun was coming up. The fog was thick, just like the day the battalion had disappeared. As he entered the valley, Morris felt the air get colder. His compass started spinning wildly. Then he saw them, hundreds of transparent soldiers from different times in history, all watching him. Among them were the familiar faces he had seen in the 55th Battalion's photographs. Colonel Parker stepped forward, his figure glowing softly in the morning light. Behind him stood his son, Tommy, Rosalie Williams with her radio, Mike Rodriguez, and David Chen. They looked exactly the same as in their army photos, except now Morris could see right through them. "Detective Morris," Parker said, "we've brought you here because it's time for the world to know part of the truth. Not everything. Some secrets of the valley must stay hidden. But people need to know that their missing soldiers aren't gone. We're still here, still serving, just in a different way." Rosalie Williams explained to Morris about their new mission as guardians of the valley. Rodriguez demonstrated his power to become invisible. Chen showed Morris a few memories from ancient battles. Tommy Parker created a window in the air, showing Morris how they could watch over their families back home. Morris sat on a rock, writing everything in his notebook with shaking hands. "If I put this in my report, nobody will believe me," he said. Colonel Parker smiled. "Some will believe, some won't. But the families of the 55th Battalion deserve to know that we're still protecting people, still fighting for what's right." Before Morris left, Rosalie gave him a message for her family. Chen asked him to tell his sister to take care of their mother. Rodriguez wanted his parents to know he was okay. Tommy Parker asked Morris to tell his mother and sister that he and his father were together and watching over them. As Morris walked back to base camp, his notebook full of impossible stories, he knew his life had changed forever. The 55th Battalion wasn't just missing. They had become part of something bigger than any normal army. They had become guardians of one of the world's greatest mysteries. In his final report, Morris wrote, "The 55th Battalion is not dead. They are not prisoners of war. They have become something our military minds cannot fully understand. They are soldiers of shadows, protecting us from dangers we can't see, fighting battles we'll never know about. Perhaps that's why the Valley of Shadows chose them. because they had the courage to become more than just soldiers. They became guardians of history itself. Detective Morris first visited the Parker family in Kansas. Mrs. Parker lived in a small white house with a big front porch. Tommy's sister, Mary, who was now 16, opened the door. When Morris showed them his army badge, Mrs. Parker's hand started shaking. She thought he was bringing bad news about her husband and son. "Mrs. Parker," Morris said gently, sitting at their kitchen table, "what I'm going to tell you might sound strange, but I promise every word is true." He told them about meeting Colonel Parker and Tommy in the valley. As he spoke, the radio on their kitchen counter suddenly turned on by itself. Through the static, they heard Tommy's voice. "Mom, Mary, we're here right now. We're listening." Mrs. Parker started crying, but they were happy tears. Mary reached out and touched the radio, feeling it grow cold under her fingers. Morris told them how Colonel Parker and Tommy were together, watching over their family. "They wanted you to know they're not suffering," he explained. "They're still soldiers, still helping people, just in a different way." Next, Morris visited Rodriguez's family in Texas. Their small farm was full of chickens and 2 friendly dogs. Rodriguez's mother was cooking dinner when Morris arrived. His father was fixing a tractor in the barn. When Morris told them about their son's new life as a phantom soldier, something amazing happened. The dogs started barking at an empty corner of the room, wagging their tails like they could see someone there. "Animals can sometimes see us." Rodriguez's voice came through Morris's radio. "The dogs know I'm here." His mother cried out in Spanish, reaching toward the corner where the dogs were barking. Though she couldn't see her son, just knowing he was there brought her peace. Chen's sister lived in San Francisco, taking care of their elderly mother. When Morris visited them, he found their house full of Chinese medicines and old photographs. Chen's sister was a doctor, and at first she didn't believe Morris's story. But then all the candles in their family shrine lit by themselves, one by one. "David always loved playing tricks," his sister said, laughing through her tears. Morris gave them Chen's message about watching over them. Their mother spoke in Chinese, and amazingly, her words came through Morris's radio in English. "My son has become a warrior spirit, like in the old stories. I am proud." Finding Rosalie Williams's family was harder. They moved around a lot because her father was also in the army. When Morris finally found them at an army base in California, Rosalie's younger brother instantly believed the story. "I knew Rosalie wasn't gone," he said excitedly. "My radio keeps picking up her voice late at night telling me to do my homework." Rosalie's parents were harder to convince until Morris played them a recording he had made in the valley. It was Rosalie's voice, singing a lullaby she used to sing to her brother. Her father, a tough army colonel, cried for the first time since Rosalie had disappeared. Some families took the news better than others. Some thought Morris was crazy. But strange things kept happening around all of them. Radios would turn on by themselves, playing songs their missing soldiers used to love. Personal items would move around when no one was watching. Dogs and cats would stare at empty spaces and wag their tails or purr. Morris gave each family his personal phone number. "If anything unusual happens," he told them, "call me. Your soldiers might be trying to send you a message." Soon his phone was ringing every day with stories. A mother who heard her son laughing in the hallway. A sister who smelled her brother's favorite coffee in an empty room. A father who saw his daughter's reflection in a window, smiling at him. The families began writing to each other, sharing their experiences. Mrs. Parker started a support group called Families of the Shadow Battalion. They met every month to talk about their phantom soldiers. They shared stories, photos, and the strange, wonderful ways their loved ones let them know they were still watching over them. One day, all the families got the same message through their radios. Colonel Parker's voice came through clearly. "We want you to know that we're okay. The valley lets us visit you sometimes, even though you can't see us. We're still soldiers, still serving our country, but now we're also protecting something bigger. We're guardians of peace, making sure the valley's power is never used for evil. Be proud of us, and know that we will always love you." The families finally had answers about what happened to their soldiers. Even though they couldn't see or hug their loved ones anymore, they knew they weren't really gone. The 55th Battalion had become something amazing, an army of guardian spirits protecting not just America, but the whole world from dangers nobody else could fight. As weeks passed, more people started talking about the Phantom Battalion. At first, most Army officials didn't believe Detective Morris's report. They said he was making up stories. But then strange things began happening at Army bases all across the country. At a base in Texas, a group of new soldiers was training late one night. Suddenly, they saw Mike Rodriguez appear, glowing softly in the dark. He showed them how to properly handle their rifles in a way that wasn't in any training manual. The next day, their shooting scores were the best in the camp's history. In California, Army radio operators started getting help from Rosalie Williams. She would appear as a faint reflection in their screens, teaching them new ways to fix broken equipment and catch hidden enemy messages. Some radio operators even learned how to hear the special frequencies that let them talk to the Phantom soldiers. David Chen began visiting military hospitals. Though most patients couldn't see him, they felt a calm presence that helped them heal faster. He used his power to share peaceful memories, helping soldiers who had bad dreams about the war. The doctors couldn't explain why their patients were getting better so quickly. Tommy Parker found he could travel to any Army base in the world. He would appear to homesick soldiers late at night, sitting with them and telling them stories about his own family. Many soldiers wrote letters home about the friendly ghost who helped them feel less lonely. Colonel Parker did something even more important. He started appearing to Army generals when they were planning battles. Though they couldn't see him clearly, they would suddenly get ideas about how to win fights with fewer soldiers getting hurt. Some generals later said they felt like they had help from an unseen advisor. The Phantom Battalion wasn't just helping the American Army. They helped soldiers from all countries who were fighting for good reasons. When they found soldiers who were scared or didn't want to fight, they would help them find peaceful ways to solve their problems. Mrs. Parker's support group grew bigger. Families from other countries joined too. They shared more stories about their Phantom soldiers. A mother in England said she saw her missing son helping lost children find their way home. A father in France talked about his daughter's ghost protecting people during big storms. Detective Morris kept getting busier. The Army made him head of a new department that studied helpful ghosts. They called it the Spiritual Support Division, though most soldiers just called it the Ghost Unit. Morris traveled around, teaching people how to know when Phantom soldiers were nearby. One of the most amazing things happened at Arlington National Cemetery, where many American soldiers are buried. Visitors started seeing members of the 55th Battalion standing guard over the graves late at night. They weren't scary ghosts. They were protective spirits, honoring the soldiers who had died. Rosalie discovered she could use her radio powers to help lost soldiers find their way home. Sometimes armies would lose contact with their troops in dangerous places. Rosalie would reach out through their radios, guiding them to safety. The soldiers never knew their guardian angel was a Phantom radio operator. Rodriguez and Chen worked together to protect supply trucks carrying food and medicine to people hurt by the war. They would appear as glowing figures in the road, warning drivers about hidden dangers ahead. Many drivers said these Phantom soldiers had saved their lives. The Valley of Shadows was changing too. It wasn't seen as a scary place anymore. Instead, people began calling it the Valley of Guardians. Though no one could enter it safely except the Phantom soldiers, people would leave flowers at its entrance. They wrote thank you notes to the Phantom Battalion for watching over their loved ones. Colonel Parker and his Phantom Army had created something new, a force that helped end fights before they began. They showed that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is find a way to make peace. Living soldiers started leaving their dog tags at the valley's entrance as promises to be peaceful whenever they could. Tommy found he could visit schools, appearing as a gentle light during history lessons about war. Children weren't scared of him. Instead, they would ask questions about what it was like to be a Phantom soldier. He taught them that real courage means protecting others and finding ways to stop fights before they start. The 55th Battalion had changed what it meant to be a soldier. They showed that true strength isn't just about fighting, it's about guarding, protecting, and helping others. They became known as the kindest ghosts in military history, the spirits who stayed behind to make the world a better place. 20 years had passed since the 55th Battalion disappeared. The world had changed a lot, but the Phantom soldiers hadn't aged a day. They still looked exactly like they did in 1944, though they had learned many new ways to help people. One morning, Detective Morris, now much older with gray hair, got an urgent call. A new war was about to start between two countries in Asia. Both sides had powerful weapons and angry leaders. But something amazing happened before the fighting could begin. Every radio in both countries suddenly started playing the same message. It was Rosalie Williams's voice, speaking in both languages at once. "Let us show you what war really means." Then, using Chen's power to share memories, the Phantom Battalion showed everyone in both countries what it felt like to be in a war. People saw everything: scared soldiers missing their families, children crying, cities being destroyed. These weren't scary or violent images. Instead, they were sad memories that made people understand the real cost of fighting. The Phantom soldiers weren't trying to frighten anyone. They just wanted everyone to understand what they were about to lose. Rodriguez and his Civil War friend Billy visited the leaders of both countries while they slept. They showed them memories of other leaders from history who had chosen peace instead of war. When the leaders woke up, they decided to talk to each other instead of fighting. In the Valley of Shadows, things were changing too. The Phantom Battalion wasn't alone anymore. Other soldiers who had died fighting for good causes were allowed to join them as guardians. Tommy Parker helped teach these new Phantom soldiers how to use their powers to help people. Colonel Parker created a special school in the valley. Here, Phantom soldiers from every time and place learned how to be guardians. "Our job isn't to fight wars anymore," he told them. "Our job is to help people find better ways to solve their problems." Mrs. Parker was very old now, but she was still running her support group. One day while they were meeting, something wonderful happened. The Phantom Battalion appeared, visible to everyone in the room. For the first time in 20 years, families could see their soldiers clearly. Rosalie Williams hugged her little brother, who was now older than she was. Rodriguez danced with his mother, who could finally touch her son again, even though her hands passed through him. Chen bowed to his sister, who had taken such good care of their mother. Tommy Parker stood with his arm around his mom while his father beamed proudly at both of them. "The valley has given us a gift," Colonel Parker explained. "Once every year, on the anniversary of our disappearance, we can be seen by our families for 1 hour. It's a reward for helping keep peace in the world." Detective Morris was there too, writing everything in his old notebook. He had filled many notebooks over the years with stories about the Phantom Battalion. "People need to know these stories," he said. "They show us that soldiers can be heroes without fighting, that the bravest thing sometimes is choosing not to fight at all." The Phantom soldiers had changed the way people thought about war. Now, before any country decided to fight, their leaders would visit the Valley of Shadows. The Phantom soldiers would show them memories of past wars, helping them understand what they were really choosing. Rosalie's radio network had grown. She could now reach anyone in the world who needed help. Lost hikers would hear her voice guiding them to safety. Sailors in storms would get directions to calm waters. Pilots having trouble would suddenly know exactly how to land safely. Rodriguez and Chen worked with children, appearing in schools around the world. They taught kids how to solve problems without fighting. "Being strong doesn't mean you have to hurt others," they would say. "True strength is being kind when it's hard and brave enough to walk away from a fight." Tommy Parker had become known as the soldier's angel. Whenever a service member anywhere in the world felt scared or alone, Tommy would appear as a gentle light, bringing comfort and courage. He reminded them that being a soldier was about protecting people, not hurting them. The 55th Battalion had become more than just guardians of the valley. They were guardians of peace itself. They showed the world that heroes don't always carry weapons. Sometimes they carry memories, wisdom, and hope for a better way to live. Back in the valley, Colonel Parker looked at his Phantom Army with pride. They had found a way to serve their country and the whole world better than they ever could have as regular soldiers. They had become the protectors everyone needed but no one expected. The soldiers who won their greatest victories not by fighting, but by teaching people not to fight at all. 50 years had passed since the 55th Battalion entered the Valley of Shadows. Detective Morris was now an old man, living in a small house near the valley's entrance. Every morning, he would sit on his porch and wave to the phantom soldiers he could sometimes see in the mist. One special morning, something amazing happened. Morris saw a bright light coming from the valley. When he walked closer, he found Colonel Parker waiting for him. "It's time, old friend," Parker said, looking exactly the same as he had 50 years ago. "The valley wants to show you something." Inside the valley, Morris saw thousands of phantom soldiers from every time in history. But they weren't alone anymore. Regular people were there too. Children, teachers, doctors, and families from all over the world. The valley was letting living people visit for the first time ever. Rosalie Williams, still young and operating her ghostly radio, explained why. "The world has changed," she said. "People aren't as quick to fight anymore. They've learned to listen to each other first. The valley thinks it's time to share some of our secrets." Morris watched as Rodriguez and Chen taught a group of children how to see phantom soldiers. "Just look with your heart, not your eyes," Rodriguez said. The children gasped with delight as they began to see the gentle spirits all around them. Tommy Parker was showing families how to use the valley's windows to watch over their loved ones who were far away. "Distance doesn't matter when love is strong," he told them. Parents smiled as they saw their children who were away at school or working in other countries. Mrs. Parker, who had passed away a few years ago, was there too. But she wasn't a phantom soldier. She was a different kind of spirit. The valley had given her a special job, helping families understand the phantom soldiers. She and Tommy could finally hug each other, two different kinds of spirits brought together by love. Detective Morris learned that the Valley of Shadows was opening itself to the world because people had finally understood its message. Wars were becoming rare. Countries talked to each other instead of fighting. When arguments started, people would remember the phantom soldiers' memories and choose peace instead. The 55th Battalion had grown into a huge family. Phantom soldiers from every country worked together, watching over the world. They appeared during natural disasters, helping rescue workers find people in trouble. They visited hospitals, comforting sick children with gentle stories. They protected travelers, keeping them safe on long journeys. Rosalie's radio network now reached every home in the world. People would hear soft music late at night, helping them sleep. Children would hear stories about brave people who chose peace over fighting. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, families would hear the voices of loved ones who had passed away, sending messages of love. Rodriguez had become known as the children's guardian. He played with lonely kids in playgrounds, visible to them as a friendly, glowing figure. He taught them games from different times in history and showed them how to be kind to each other. Chen worked with doctors around the world. He used his power to share memories to help people with sad memories feel better. Hospitals started keeping special rooms where phantom soldiers could visit patients, bringing peace and comfort to those who were hurting. Colonel Parker gathered everyone together, the phantom soldiers, the visiting families, and Detective Morris. "The Valley chose us 50 years ago," he said, "because it knew the world needed to change. We thought we were just soldiers, but we became teachers, showing people that love is stronger than hate." Morris looked around at all the faces, both living and phantom. He saw children playing with ghost soldiers, families hugging spirit relatives, and former enemies working together as guardian spirits. The Valley of Shadows wasn't dark anymore. It glowed with the light of countless kind souls. "Write this in your notebook, old friend," Colonel Parker said to Morris. "Tell them that the 55th Battalion never really disappeared. We just found a better way to serve. Instead of fighting wars, we help stop them. Instead of taking lives, we protect them. We are still soldiers, but now we fight for peace. As the sun set on the valley one last time, Morris wrote his final note. The Phantom Battalion taught us the greatest lesson of all, that true courage isn't about winning battles, it's about preventing them. They showed us that every person, whether living or spirit, has the power to make peace, and in doing so they turned the Valley of Shadows into the Valley of Light. The 55th Battalion had completed their greatest mission. They hadn't just changed the way people thought about war, they had changed the way people thought about each other. In the end, they proved that the strongest power isn't weapons or armies. It's the simple choice to be kind, to forgive, and to protect those who need help. And if you visit the valley today, you might just hear Rosalie's radio playing softly, or see Rodriguez playing with children, or feel Chen's calming presence. Because the Phantom soldiers are still there, still watching, still protecting. The guardians who taught the world that the best way to honor those who died in wars is to live in peace.